This is actually from, so the team that collected data this week, I just want to show you this and then I'll frame the discussion. So Carly Hyde, who's our new research coordinator on the study, and I have to just, is Scott still here? Scott Huberty, so Scott has given his blood, sweat, and tears at Dup15q for 3 years and now is starting neuroscience, graduate school in neuroscience this summer, so is leaving us, but I feel like we have to acknowledge him because he's been working with these families for many, many years. And he's passed the baton over to Carly, who's over here, who's been, got thrown in this week. But anyway, I just want to show you what happened this week. So this is, the group saw, and I say they because I had sort of the idea and we set the systems in place, but I did no data collection. So they saw a total of 39 kids. Most of the kids were between ages 4 and 10, which is like the half of that pie chart. I'm going to skip that. So just in terms of thinking about, you heard about the ADOS, so most of the kids were in Module 1, which is for kids who are pre-verbal or have very limited language, which sort of fits the, I think, the profile of our kids. Most kids got a Mullen. Some were high enough to get a DOS, which is another measure of cognitive function for either older kids or kids who had more abilities. And I love that. I just wanted to break it down for you. And again, thank you, Carly, for putting this together, just to give you a sense of who they saw. So 62% IDEX, 38% interstitials, 48% of our kids had epilepsy. So we'll start being able to kind of answer some of the questions we've been talking about. Again, we collected EEG, cognitive, behavioral data, motor, and that gives you just the age breakdown. So I just wanted to show you that quickly.
Motor was on 45.
Oh, motor was 45, sorry. Okay, so she's like, okay. So, but I thought just to talk a little bit about outcome measures, I wanted to start with this figure, and this was actually, Dan and I wrote a piece that was called, I remember the first title for this was a little bit more pessimistic and negative, but this is what it was called, Clinical Trials for Neurodevelopmental Disorders at a Therapeutic Frontier, and it was based on actually that recent Fragile X trial that quote unquote failed, where there wasn't shown to be a positive outcome in the patients compared to the controls. And it brought up the question of kind of why do clinical trials fail? And several sort of themes came up that we discussed in that piece, but also that have just been, I think, discussed a lot in the neurodevelopmental disorders field. Even when we have what seem like more targeted treatments, why are we seeing negative outcomes? And I think there's multiple reasons for this that have kind of been, I hope, kind of implicitly the theme in some of what we've been talking about through these past 2 days. You know, one issue is patient selection. So who are the kinds of kids we're selecting for these trials, even within a rare condition where we kind of have a sense that there may be more sort of homogeneity and etiology. Even there's variability, and are we choosing the right patients? Along those lines, there's an issue of, are we choosing the right age of patients for some of these trials, right? We're doing a lot of studies in adults with these conditions where we might think that by then a lot of the effects of the genetic variation and the sequelae thereof have already taken effect. So are we able to modulate things later in life? Drug choice is another one. Are we using medications that are really targeting the symptoms or the condition that we're trying to treat? We talked about timing, but I think the big one, the big issue, and again, some of the goal for some of the talks today, especially, we're really trying to get us to think about this issue of outcome measures. What are we measuring? What is the actual behavior or not that we're trying to change, and are the things we're measuring really sensitive to change in certain periods of time with the drugs that we're actually using? And so in that context, actually, in the field in general of autism and neurodevelopmental disabilities, there's been a lot of discussion and emphasis on refining our outcome measures and thinking more carefully about what our outcome measures should be in trials. And it's led to a big initiative, a nationwide initiative on becoming more methodologically rigorous and thinking about biomarkers in clinical trials. Because one of the big concerns about the outcome measures often used in trials thus far is that the outcome measures are based on caregiver report. And while that's important, because obviously in the end they're the ones who know the child the best, there's always a concern about there being a reporting bias and even a placebo effect, which I know was talked about a little bit this morning in the CBD talk. But also that maybe those parent report or caregiver reports are just not, again, sensitive to change in sort of the short periods of time that we're doing these trials. So there's the issue of sort of bias, but also maybe just that they're too crude to measure what we're really trying to assay or study. And so I'll just remind everyone what's considered a biomarker or a surrogate endpoint. And this was reviewed recently in JAMA. So a biomarker or surrogate endpoint is a characteristic that's objectively measured, so it doesn't have to be EEG, and evaluated as an indication of either a normal biological process, a pathogenic process, or a pharmacological response to therapeutic interventions. And so biomarkers can be really useful for things like risk prediction, stratification, patient selection, and measuring target engagement of a drug even before we might see the behavioral outcome we're looking for. And I would add in asterisks, we would like biomarkers to be grounded in mechanism, developmentally informed for our populations, and both practical and scalable. And so I'll just quickly mention that in that setting, there's actually now a big NIH-funded effort. It's NIH, Simons, and other organizations that have funded a big consortium called the Autism Biomarkers Consortium for Clinical Trials. So we're a part of that. It's also Duke, Yale, Harvard, and Seattle. And we've actually been tasked with this job. And I bring this up only because I think that this is a tall order. And I think we're probably more well-positioned to do this work in more well-defined genetic subtypes of neurodevelopmental conditions. And so and then I'll stop and we can talk about outcome measures. But the ABCCT, just so you know, has been charged with the following three things. One is to evaluate candidate biomarkers that will be eventually useful for clinical trials. So we're talking about things like not just feasibility, but things like construct validity, reliability over time and across sites, discriminant validity. We're asked to compare the sensitivity of biomarkers to conventional caregiver and clinical assessments. And then as this endeavor is developing, we're going to actually create a resource database of data so that it can be used, by others to answer other types of questions. And you might ask what the biomarkers are, and I won't go into all this in detail. There's several measures of using eye tracking, EEG, and some quantitative behavioral measures, not motor, but we're looking at social interaction with a NOLDIS software to quantify things like, again, social interaction and vocalizations and things like that. The EEG and eye tracking measures are really based on both resting EEG resting state networks and connectivity, and then also looking at social processing, so face processing, processing of biological motion, that sort of thing. And the kids are seen at baseline 6 weeks later and 6 months later with no intervention per se, like there's no clinical trial yet. It's really about asking about how these tools stratify kids, how they relate to clinical phenotypes, and then how stable are they over time. So that's been a really active effort, and now, and actually Stormy, you and I were talking about this, there's now an interest by NINDS to do a similar, I think, type of project, or at least think about a project like this in other populations, either syndromic forms of ASD or intellectual disability, because in this study we actually exclude anyone with a known genetic syndrome. We collect genetics data, but we exclude for the syndromic forms of ASD. And I'll just mention that this is something Alicia's been really involved in, as is Vanessa, but there's a group called, now it's called Agenda as of like a week ago, but was called GDAC. And it's a group of various advocacy groups who have come together to really think about these questions around among other things, the problems in clinical trials, and how do we band together to really develop registries and studies so that we can actually be best positioned to be successful in future clinical trials. And so biomarkers and outcome measures is an area that's been discussed quite a bit in this group. So I bring these things up just because I think, again, we're at a place in the field where we need good trials, we need effective treatments, but we need to be really, I think, mindful of how we design these things so that we're not setting ourselves up for failure. And I would just say, hearing all the talks over the last 2 days, I think this group is we're getting to a place where we probably could start talking about how we want to work together to sort of at least position ourselves to be ready for trials if they're, as they come. And so in that setting, I'm just going to open it up for us to first talk about, if we were going to think about outcome measures in clinical trials, what would those look like? What would those be? And maybe we can go down the path here and have people at least give some thoughts on that, and then we can open it up